Okay, so we're going to start with a story, an nTIDE story, just to be a little bit different. I think Megan and Andrew has already talked a little bit about it. You've tasted a little bit about it, but how did this all start? So it really all started from a reporter, and we're going to name the publication, but I think not, a new online publication that started about 5 years ago. And the reporter contacted us about this nTIDE, the National Trends in Disability Employment Numbers that came out. And he interviewed John O'Neill. He might have interviewed Andrew, I can't remember, but I know he interviewed John. And he just could not get the numbers right. We gave him all this information, and he had trouble between the labor participation rates, what does that mean, employment to population rates, and we know it's difficult, that sometimes it goes up, it goes down, but he just couldn't get it right. So from that, we decided that maybe we should start doing a report, and we had talked about it. This was a collaborative relationship between the University of New Hampshire and Kessler Foundation, funded under NIDE Stats ROTC. So I said, yes, we're going to do this. And to make it more interesting, let's put together not only a monthly data sheet, but let's try to do a graphic. So we had our communications team come up with the graphics. It was actually their idea to do this whole report. And we tested it for a couple of months, and we got some feedback, and then it manifested into what it is today. And really, it's taken 5 years for people to start quoting it and look for it. Kessler Foundation does a distribution, UNH does a different distribution. And from the monthly news release, we now have a webinar, and we have social media and hashtags, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So it's a press release and an infographic, as I mentioned, and it comes out on Jobs Friday, which is when the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases its numbers. And the source of the data is really our official unemployment rate for people who don't live in institutions between 16 and 64. But we really had never broken out disability in the way that we really wanted to break it out. And as Andrew mentioned, Megan mentioned, it was based on the 6 criteria of the CPS. So because it's not seasonally adjusted, as you saw in the chart earlier, and we'll show more in a minute, it's year over year. And so we're looking the same month from 1998 to, to 2018 to 2019. So again, we now have our Lunch and Learn. So if you haven't signed up yet, please see me, please see anybody from UNH, and we're happy to add you to our mailing list. So last month, we had a really great webinar. It has usually the same format. It starts with John and Andrew talking about the numbers. It moves into the news, so Denise Rozell is also part of our team on our webinars from AUCD, and she provides all the latest government and policy news. And then we get to the most interesting part, which is really an interviewee from the field, somebody who's been influenced by employment, looking for a job, can get their real experience out to our audience. And last month we had Alex Frazier, who's from Autistic Reality, speak about his experiences as a young man with autism who's really blossomed through employment and gone out into the world. We had Terry Sue Hartman also speak last month about her work in disability and employment through AINSOF Communications. And at the end, we take lots and lots of questions. So that gives you a brief overview of how it came to be and our process. And now I'd like to turn it over to John O'Neill, who'll give you more of the nitty-gritty.
I'm going to report on the data that we presented last month. Next slide.
Actually, you have to push the arrow.
Oh, the arrow? All right.
And Megan already stole our thunder, so I don't know who gave her our numbers.
This one? Uh-huh. Okay. We report on the employment to population ratio, and last month we saw that people with disabilities had a bit of a decline. It was effectively no change, but there was a bit of a decline. We also report on the employment to population ratio for people without disabilities, and there was a slight increase. in last month. We also report on the labor force participation rate. And last month, of course, you know the labor force participation rate includes those that are working as well as those that are looking. And there was no change last month. And there was a bit of a, for people with disabilities, and there was a bit of an uptake amongst people without disabilities. We also track, and Andrew has showed these numbers before, but we track the employment to population ratio. We track it since the 6 disability questions were included in the CPS. And we do that for people without disabilities as well as folks with disabilities. And from this slide, you can obviously see that in the beginning of the Great Recession, there was quite a pronounced and long-lasting drop in the employment to population ratio for people with disabilities. You can also see there was a drop also for people without disabilities, but their recovery happened sooner and has been sustained across time. And we put a trend line in, so so we can kind of make sense out of the up and down. And again, you see the story that I just described. It looks like there may be a bit of leveling off as of the end of last year. Andrew's going to talk a little bit about intersectionalities. This is something that we're going to add to the nTIDE, possibly as part of an end-of-year report.
Thank you, John. We have in the past done year-end reports, years in review. And, you know, it's pretty basic looking at the average level of month. These are all, nTIDE is monthly, and we average up all the months of the year and compare it to previous years. And, you know, we'll probably continue to do some work in that area. However, we've always wanted to look at more detailed information. You know, we have the raw data comes out not on the first Friday. The raw data comes out, usually it's lagged a week before we get the raw data where we can actually look at age, race, gender, education level, and things like that. We also have another project under the Stats RTC, which Sarah Bogie is leading with AUCD, Associations of University Centers of Excellence on Disability, where Denise is from. And we're going to look at intersectionality, but we're going to do it in context with other the organizations from that other intersection. So do it with groups that represent those folks. And try to develop an annual infographic each year with a different group, and then continue to produce that infographic each year as part of the compendium effort. So this is our intersectionality that we're doing as part of nTIDE. And so we'll start off with disability, and we'll look at the employment to population. This is the average monthly for last year. So we took last year's average, or last year's estimates, and this is for ages 16 to 64, so it's roughly the same. Maybe some differences between nTIDE because nTIDE is pulled off of the website from BLS. This is generated from the public use files, so there could be some differences. So this is the average monthly, this is employment to population ratio. And so we see the gap between people with and without disabilities. And then, so it's a gap of 43.5 percentage points. There's some rounding errors there. I didn't round at the right time. And then we looked at white only, and then everyone else, all right? And so we wanted to see what kind of gap, whether the gap, whether there was an additional effect of being in those groups. And so what we found for people without disabilities, there was a substantial difference between white only and everyone else, and that's 12.1 percentage points difference. For people without disabilities, and remember we're starting at a pretty low rate, low percentage to begin with, there actually wasn't much difference. Now this does lump Hispanic populations, Asians, African Americans, and others into one category. So there could be some variation within that, and indeed we do. I wish I could bring up the Excel spreadsheet. John said, let's do age, race, gender, ethnicity, race by each month over the last, since 2008.
And you said that was splitting hairs.
Yeah, I did say it was splitting hairs, and I've split enough hairs in my life. But when we get to the finite point, that maybe where it delves over and looks at, what Sarah's doing with the much larger sample of the American Community Survey are the data sources that she ends up using for the intersectionality with John Cheetah at AUCD. We did the same exercise for gender, and so you see the gap again, and then men and women. And so you see the gap between men and women for without disabilities. It's an 11 percentage point gap, still pretty big. And for women without men and women without disabilities, there's a 4 percentage point difference. But if we look at percentage difference or percentage change between the two, we see they're roughly the same, right? And I'm sure if I wrap standard errors around these, this would probably not be a statistically significant difference. And so what it's suggesting is that that disability may not have it has an added effect, but it's the same as without disabilities potentially. So there may not be a double kind of disability. But again, I'd want to check this with the ACS. I'd probably want to ask Eric to run some numbers with the NHIS to see if this holds throughout. One of the things we've been doing, and you should see the spreadsheet that John and I and Elaine have been working with, this thing it's a monster. What we have been doing is looking at the trends in these to see if that beneficial group, so the beneficial stuff that John showed, the beneficial jump up that John showed, whether that was true for all ages, race, gender mixes. And look at the mix between gender and race as well. And it appears that many groups have. Many of the subpopulations have benefited, have had rising employment over the last 2 years as compared to previous years. And I forget exactly which ones, but you'll have to stay tuned for nTIDE to see. And maybe we'll do one little tidbit per month, who knows? Who knows how we're going to do this? We thought about having a quarterly report. We also want to do industry. You look at industries and things like that. There's so much we could do with these data. The question ends up being, do we get too far ahead of ourselves? So I didn't provide standard errors or confidence intervals for these. You'll be seeing that more tomorrow as we bring in a little bit more careful release of statistics. The key to understand is that many times when you see the slight decline or rise in the unemployment rate, many times that's not statistically significant. And the BLS really doesn't tell us that. So we're trying to bring a little more rigor to the situation. So with that, I'll stop there. And I think we should probably have Denise come up and talk about our working lunch. One of the things that we had to be very careful with is that the federal government and UNH's itself is getting more and more specific about spending. And we want to make sure we have a productive working lunch. Now, we can't have a keynote speaker, which is a typical way of doing it, because we can't bring food into this auditorium. And the people online, you know, they don't get the food either, so we don't want to rub it in. Although they can participate in this information session that we're going to do during lunch. But I'm going to turn it over to Denise. And Denise, it might be nice to hear a little bit about kind of how you put together the nTIDE news.
Sure.
So if you could just
Sure.
give us a brief chat, because that's a big part of it.
I am Denise Rozell. I'm with AUCD. I'm the Director of Policy Innovation. And as I say on these calls, on the nTIDE calls pretty regularly, I'm the policy geek. I am not the research geeks. That's these guys. They understand that stuff. I'm the policy geeks.
Time.
I do, because I have such great respect for the research people, but
And
that's not
you.
me. So two things. One, what we do in the section on news from the field that I do on the nTIDEs every month is try to find both what's going on within federal policy, which might be of interest. The new bill that's been introduced, raising the wage, for instance, which does away with the 14C program, or there's another bill that Senator Casey has just introduced in the last couple of weeks called Transforming Competitive Integrated Employment. I think it's a very long title with not a good acronym. So we talk about that, and that's also phasing out 14C, but providing some funding for change and systems change. So what I'm saying is we highlight whatever those pieces of legislation are that might be going on from in the policy arena that would be of interest to folks on this on the call that we do. And then I also try and look for things that have come out in the last month that you may or may not have seen. From a variety of different sources. So it may be a study that's come out, like some of the ones that you're hearing about here. It may be a survey. It may be an international study you may not have seen. It may be new materials that, particularly that the Department of Labor may have up, either in their GPS site or that earn from that's funded by ODEP or whoever it may be that's out there, something from RSA perhaps, that's new materials that are out that you may not have seen yet. What I try to keep in mind is that the calls are made up of a whole variety of people. There's the research geeks like me, there's the policy geeks like me, there's the research geeks like them, there's families in some cases, there are individuals with disabilities who may not fit into any of these categories, but of course are highly concerned about what's going on in employment. So I try to think about all of that in picking out a variety of things to put up. And I would encourage anyone who's listening or anyone who's here, if you have something coming out that you think, woo, this would be a great thing to highlight, send it my way. And I'm just D. Rozell, D-R-O-Z-E-L-L, at aucd.org. And I'd be happy to, I won't guarantee including everything that gets sent my way, but I'd be happy to look at it. So that's kind of what my piece of it is. And then I usually do the interview of the person with a disability in employment. Sometimes other people interview, but generally I do that interview as well. And it's the way I explain it to folks who I interview, it's to help people who are listening to the call who may not have day-to-day impact by people with disabilities in employment to remember that there are people behind all the numbers. And so we try to interview a wide variety of people about employment, what they're doing, what's interesting, barriers to employment, all kinds of things. So that leads me to what we are going to be doing at lunch. What we would like to do is take advantage of those of you who are here and those who are watching on the web. You are more than welcome also to send along your thoughts. And we have a little questionnaire, which is going to be out there. There's one for each of you. And we'd like you to both to fill it in for yourself, but also if it's helpful to talk at your table about what it is you'd like to see. So in these nTIDE Lunch and Learners, we're using you as a survey group. So what's your favorite part of the nTIDE monthly webcast? The statistics, the news from the field, that'd be me, the interview with the person with the disability or the guest speaker. And then what topics do you want to hear more about? Do you have ideas for specific speakers? As people on the panels today have been talking, I've been making frantic notes about new ideas. And other ideas to improve what we do in this monthly webcast. And literally, we will pick up your papers afterwards, and we're going to look at everything that you put down. If you have other ideas of things that you think would improve it, that you think you'd like to hear about, one of the things we've been doing recently is a series. So like right now, we just started, the one that you just saw is the first in a series of 3 around employment and the arts and media. We've done some other series. We have some other series planned coming up. Do you like that idea? Do you like the series? Do you have a series you'd like to see? I was making notes just now about a series around self-employment, entrepreneurship, contingent employment. All of those things might be really interesting. But we want to hear from you. So when you go out there, there's questionnaires. Please fill them out. Please talk at your table. Sometimes you may have, depending on how you process information, it's probably pretty clear to anybody who knows me, I process verbally, so it helps me to talk at the table.
So I just wanted to add to talk about, Denise mentioned we have a series on the media. In the fall, later in the year, we're doing something on, I think, mental health as well. But just as a teaser, so our next month's surprise guest will be Joey Travolta, who is John Travolta's brother. And for those of you who don't know, he runs a program called Inclusion Films on the West Coast, and also film camps during the year. So his program is primarily for adults with autism and other disabilities, training them behind the camera. So, and he's great. He's going to be interviewing somebody who works with him as a cameraman. And actually this fall, John Travolta, his brother, hired some of his students to work on the film, and they've gotten enough credits that they've actually been able to join some of the unions in LA. So it's a really big program, so please tune in.
Well, and that's another one too. Do you like the fact that we are now doing, in some of these cases, the interviewee is someone who has been through the employment program or somehow ties into the topic and the guest speaker? Do you like that? That'd be another question that we would love to hear from you. So I'm going to thank you in advance for all of your great ideas, and hopefully you'll be hearing more of them soon.
So again, it's a working lunch. What we encourage you to do is to talk to the people at your table. There will be hopefully some people from UNH circulating or sitting at your tables and spying on you to make sure that you're working. We do not want to violate any federal guidelines or anything like that, even though it's hard to find those guidelines. If anybody knows where those guidelines may be for the Department of Health and Human Services, please let us know. Because it's not a lot written down about what's exactly expected of a working lunch. But we do want your input. I won't take offense if the statistics are not the most important thing that you sign up for, because Elaine thinks they're not the most popular thing. I think they are. So in event, we're going to break now unless anybody has any questions. Any questions about nTIDE or anything? Sally? Anybody online too?
I don't know if this is too late for this kind of question, but we always have difficulty with coding contingent employment or casual employment when we calculate an employment rate, for example, from a study. I'm sure you're facing that, and what do you typically do if a person has contingent employment? How do you code that in terms of, say, the recency of that employment or the promise?
Yeah, Megan might know more about the more detailed questions about contingent work that are in the CPS. For me, I look at hours worked, and I look at whether you work or not. I don't actually code up contingent work. But Megan, there might be some questions in some of the supplements to the CPS that could be used.
And in what time period are you looking?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So with the ACS, or I'm sorry, with the CPS, usually it's either the last week or the last month. The past 30 days. For the March supplement to the CPS, it's last calendar year. And the reason they do it in March is because that's when you have your W-2s and you have all your income information. And so it used to be called the income supplement. And so you have questions about last year and whether you worked full-time, part-time, whether you worked all weeks, or, it has a lot of different questions about weeks worked and hours worked on a typical week.
No minimum on hours worked?
I've played around with that years ago, where I wanted at least 1 hour per week. So I've played around with that number. We can talk more about how that's coded, and we should get Megan back in the room and you should ask her, because she looks at some of her and Deb do work with the supplements to the CPS, which have a lot more detailed information about this kind of stuff.
Thank you.
And it was too late for that question. That was last panel, come on. But we welcome the question. All right, so without further ado, we can break for our working lunch. And again, chat with people at your tables and fill out those forms. And statistics are the best one, so we already know that. What's the next best one?